Hi, I'm Kevin Vasquez. Today I'm joined by Richard Nix and Doug Bruce. And now, let's talk textiles. Welcome everyone to Talking Textiles. I'm Kevin Vasquez from Made in the Shade Tent Rentals. The goal of this podcast is to get to know the wide variety of positions and markets that make the advanced textiles world turn. We will be talking to professionals in different roles throughout the series to help inspire the next generation of textile professionals and anyone interested in learning more about others' journey in the world of textiles. ATA organizes and supports events throughout the year, including the upcoming tent conference taking place January 11th through the 13th in Nashville, Tennessee in 2027. Have access to targeted customer base in a single location and gain knowledge through robust education designed to grow your business. Visit textiles.org/tent conference to learn more. Our featured guests are Richard Nix and Doug Bruce. Welcome to the podcast. Richard, please tell the listeners about your company and what you do in it. Also, how long have you been in the events industry for?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. I'm Richard Nix, and I am the Technical Standards Program Manager for ESTA, the Entertainment Services and Technology Association. ESTA is an ANSI standards development organization. We're accredited to write standards and have been doing so since about 1995. I personally have been involved in the industry since 1986 and have been involved in writing safety standards since, probably 1994, 93. In that time frame. It's been a long road, and I am certainly honored. It's my pleasure to be here with everyone today to talk about the things we're going to talk about.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. And Doug, how about you? Tell us about how long you've been with your company, what you do in it, and also how long you've been in the events industry.
Hi, everyone. Well, thanks for having me today. This is super exciting. I'm ready to have an intense conversation. My name is Doug Bruce. I am a senior safety advisor for Creative Safety. We're an Austin-based safety consultant company, and we come on board in the live event industry kind of like a safety producer. We're not just occupational hazards. We also look at design. We look at crowd management. We look at all the aspects from concept to completion in the live event space as a safety partner. I've had the distinct privilege of working with Richard on the ESTA program, where we write recommendations that ultimately become ANSI standards. And I also get to work in the industry in a safety capacity. I've been working in safety for a little over 10 years, and I've been in the live event industry most of my career. Just as an aside, I've worked in different positions, producing events and working in experiential marketing. I've worked indoor and outdoor events, and recently pursued a master's in emergency management because I wanted to be able to learn how to speak the public safety language as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. And without people, we don't have events. And during our events, we have to make sure everybody's safe and secure and underneath a tent structure that's going to protect them to a certain degree. And then at some point, they should be evacuating it or leaving that premises. And that's something that we're going to kind of roll into kind of going forward. But I appreciate you guys introducing both yourselves. You definitely got some years in and come with some great industry knowledge and are kind of showing us some sides of this of what we do every day in the live events world that sometimes people may, I don't want to say necessarily overlook, but you're there in a crowd, you're enjoying the event, you're not thinking about how am I going to get out of here? How am I going to evacuate in case something's going on? Or is that stake holding down that tent strong enough? Or is that enough weight on the leg there? It's those kind of things that we as a tent rental warehouse locations look at, and you guys also as well. The crowd typically is there just to have a good time, and that's what we want to make sure again that they're safe, secure, and they can enjoy the events. So, what do you guys see as like kind of the current state of the industry regarding event safety and culture, especially around like tenting safety? Richard, you can kind of start us off. Just what are you kind of seeing as the state of the industry now? As we progress, are we getting a little bit more stringent on certain wind speeds that we need to get out of there? What are you kind of seeing now?
Well, I'll start by sort of following on something that you said just a minute ago, Kevin. You're right. The things that you mentioned are the kinds of things that we pay attention to, and the public generally does not. In fact, folks like us have a responsibility, a duty to provide a safe and a successful event. Those are really the two major goals that we have with these live events. You might think that the public has complete awareness about their own personal safety when they come to these events, but nothing could be further from the truth because they think we've thought of everything. They are coming to these events as a break away from their normal everyday working reality. These are times for fun and relaxation, and like I said, just a break away. Now, to really get towards a more direct answer to the question, over the years, what I've seen is a very much increased awareness of safety, both a safety awareness and consciousness in the industry and with public safety. There have unfortunately been several events that have occurred, accidents, incidents that have occurred over the course of several years that have raised the public awareness to the kinds of hazards that people are exposed to when they go to these events. And as a result of that, we have written standards that, in theory, are supposed to help manage those hazards and make the event a safer place for people to attend.
Richard, I would fully agree with that. In the last 20 years or so, safety has become something at the forefront. And obviously, it comes out of tragedies, right? The thing that comes to mind is the Indiana State Fair stage collapse, which was part of the founding of the Event Safety Alliance. But, there are so many other examples, and safety is no longer something on the back burner. It's something producers are thinking about and have to think about.
Yeah, that's true. I think the Indiana State Fair stage collapse was probably the tipping point. No pun intended. Was the tipping point for safety awareness when it comes to. Now, I think that put the focus more on large scale events, but it filters down to the smallest of events, particularly any event that's got any kind of a structure involved, whether it's a tent or signage, towers, video walls, display aspects, or whatever that might be. There are inherent hazards that go along with all of those things. And our job is to make sure that we've minimized those hazards as much as possible.
Yeah,
If we're
exactly.
starting with the way this industry works, I mean, I think there's a conversation that Richard was alluding to, which is as it relates to tents and temporary structures in general, the structure is just the beginning. We do things in them. Sometimes we put things on them. We use them sometimes in ways that the manufacturer was not initially intending them to be used for. So I think there's a lot of area for discussion about how we as an industry use this resource, and it's an incredibly important one. It's kind of an afterthought for some producers. Oh, we'll get a tent there, but actually someone has to make sure it's the right one, it's the right material, it shows up with the right components, it's built carefully and correctly. There's quite a bit of process there.
Yeah, Doug, you kind of hit some pretty good points there too. Doug, now you have been, of course, working in these events, and like you said, come into safety after the fact. What I've noticed definitely within the last 10 to 15 years, of course, even to more recent, is the advent of seeing more crew with hard hats, safety vests, more of those kind of PPE or certain kind of ways to build the tents now, right? The big structures, they've got more scissor lifts, boom lifts, and all that. Is that something you've noticed as well as that uptick in that safety aspect, not only for the event itself, but also the installers, the people who are building the structures, is their safety culture has changed from the install to the strike. You've noticed that too?
You used the word that I was gonna use, which I'm glad you did, which is safety culture. It's we have grown as an industry in our safety culture, partially out of compliance, probably, but the other reason is that people are seeing that actually there is the ability to mitigate risk, and that comes from proper planning and the elimination of hazards. And of course, PPE is the last line of defense in the hierarchy of controls, right? Like PPE is the minimum. But it's gotten so much better in our industry. I mean, it's gone from me seeing tent installers in specific, maybe 10 years ago being frankly often some of the most precarious work or people free climbing or just showing up rather ready to go, but potentially prepared from a safety perspective to recently I've been on event sites where the tenting companies are literally leading the way in terms of, they've done a job safety analysis. Their folks show up with properly fitting hard hats. They are trained to use a forklift or the equipment they need. They know how to rig and coordinate with the crane if there's one involved. They're wearing the appropriate PPE and they're actually thinking about safety, or they are speaking with safety professionals, which is an incredibly awesome step forward for our industry.
You're right, Doug. And I want to add to that. Not long ago, many years ago, but not in the grand scheme of time. It's not a long time ago when we were working sort of in the Wild West sort of a mentality. People might suggest occasionally you might want to have steel toe boots on, or you might want to wear a hard hat. And people would look at you like, what? You don't need a hard hat. We don't ever wear hard hats. And now the safety culture has evolved, like Doug says, where people are showing up to the job site because they know not only what's expected of them, but they have an increased self-awareness of safety while they're on the job. And they also have the safety culture awareness that if they are demonstrating to their coworkers that they are willing to do this, and without question, it's just all part of the job, that other people will more easily adapt to that. And I agree fully that we've seen a significant change over the past several years in terms of just the general job site safety culture.
But the other aspect of safety culture that's grown is, and Kevin, this is probably what you're working your way towards here, is, we've accomplished some things with job site function safety and PPE, but actually more conversations around, the engineering and the trigger points for weather and things like that. More people are having those conversations with their suppliers and even manufacturers than ever before.
Yeah, true. I agree.
That is exactly where I was working on segueing into was you again, we've seen that shift in the rental world culture of bumping up their PPE standards and doing some different safety processes, looking at what's going around situational awareness, all those kind of things. And sometimes it does stem from what happens internally in a company, whether it be an incident happening, someone getting hurt, or a near miss, or whatever it may be. But also, it stems sometimes from the world we're around, where something could happen within any second. So you got to talk about while you're working there on the site, where you're going to evacuate in case something happens. What if there's an earthquake or whatever it may be? Those are things that need to be discussed, not only with your crew and when that's going on, but like you guys are saying now, it bleeds out into the okay, is this tent going to survive X amount of mile per hour wind? Yes, it's rated for 100 plus, right? No one should be in that thing at all at that point. That's what that structure is rated for. So, what do you guys, what do you both see when it does come to like event planning or an evacuation planning? Like, what are you guys kind of hearing out there? Most manufacturers are starting to put on their flame resistant tags that, about 35 or 38 miles an hour is the miles per hour to get and evacuate out of that tent. You don't want to be in there that at all during that time when things become projectiles or whatever it may be. That's kind of what they've landed on. And I know, Richard, when we talked, you hit on some points of where those numbers came from. So, I'd like to hear from you kind of what you're seeing and what you're kind of noticing that the evacuation points and all that are changing now or where they're at currently.
Well, I'm gonna defer to Doug in just a minute because what I can relate would be firsthand experience from maybe 15 to 20 or 30 years ago. And, maybe for the past 15 years, I really know more about what I've heard secondhand from people who are actually on event sites than what I've actually personally experienced. And Doug he is right there on site for all of this. So what I see, what I had seen before, and what I still see today, and what I think is still a problem, is that the user of the tent, the general public, is still not quite up to speed on what that you a that there is such a thing as an evacuation, and b when it's time to do that, you have to do it. What I have seen and what I have heard, anytime that there's a tent incident, is almost always people are being told, go into the tent. It's starting to rain and the wind's starting to whip up. Go into the tent, which is exactly the wrong thing to tell people to do. Specifically when there's a wind event, heavy rain, I don't know at what point you got to have a threshold for how much is too much. But we see fatalities because people try to hold a tent down, a tent pole, or try to hold the sides of the tent down while it was literally blown away. And to me, that seems to be the single largest obstacle that we all together have to overcome in terms of having the users understand that there's a hard line between go and no go. And somebody has to be willing to enforce that hard line. And people have to be willing to go along with it when that time comes. And that's when I would hand it over to Doug to see what he's actually seeing on site.
There's a
Yeah.
number of things. So the first is that we have to build these tents correctly and go based on the engineering that comes with them, hopefully, if such a tent has engineering, where we're looking at all sorts of variables like terrain and temperature and type of ballast and any of the variables that come into play there. So the foundation is how is it built and what's it built for. Having weather triggers and a high wind action plan is something that event organizers should do. And there's a weather preparedness standard, an ANSI standard, as well as the event safety guide talks a lot about this. And we could do an entire pod and then some talking about weather triggers and how we use them and, dynamic assessment of those variables. A tent can be used in some places to shelter from rain, but when you bring lightning or wind, it can be dangerous because structures have limitations. And it's difficult from the event side to say definitively what kind of storm might be coming in or what it would allow you to do. So generally the rule is, stay away from tents. And when we talk about things like emergencies and evacuation, I think sometimes we talk about it in this very almost binary concept of you make a decision for a full or a phased evacuation and you're almost draining the tap. You're opening the bucket and everybody kind of leaves the venue. But actually, if you've been to an outdoor festival and you have worked with an audience that you're telling them to seek shelter, the first thing they do is go stand as deep and as densely in a tent as they can. And so then there's a number of questions about grounding and wind limitations and things that need to be considered. But actually, in most cases, nobody should be under a tent. And then you have to communicate those people to continue evacuating. So it can be complex. I hope that answers your question. It's quite a gamut.
Yeah, definitely. I think it, got us to a good point of discussing what, you work on these sites consistently, right? Now, when we are talking about those evacuation points or what needs to happen if inclement weather comes or thunder or lightning, like you were saying, what do you work with the tent companies themselves, or do you guys just gather some information and then come up with a plan on your own that you relay to the team working there, whether it's the operations team or someone, the whole group itself at like a music festival? Where does that tree go, that phone tree of understanding what structure is there, what it's rated for, and all that to implementing it to the group you're working with?
There are a number of variables when it comes to event operations and decision making. And I don't think any two events operate exactly the same way. What I would say is that the tent manufacturer is quite literally a stakeholder in the conversation. Well, the manufacturer or the provider, really. They'll know the limitations, they'll know how it's built. There's someone you want to talk to and you're trying to understand your tent. But they are not necessarily, in my experience, driving that conversation. The conversation around limitations and especially the decision making with adverse weather needs to come from those who are informed about things overall across the event organizer. So they should hopefully be considering things like the limitations presented by an engineer, or their previously written operations plan, or any of the other variables that might come from an authority having jurisdiction.
Well,
Yeah.
let me add something that takes a different approach to that, just for the sake of this conversation. Uh, as Doug said, that the tent manufacturers are absolutely stakeholders here. And from my perspective, okay, devil's advocate perspective, if I hear that tent is engineered to 110 miles an hour, why in the world do I care? Because I'm not going to be anywhere near that tent at 110 mile an hour winds. And I shouldn't be anywhere near that tent at 110 mile an hour winds, much less if they're telling us to get out of the tent at 40 miles an hour. It's probably because there's some kind of a design factor or factor of safety that maybe we could sort of apply. In the world of stage rigging, concert events and things like that, we generally talk about design factors in terms of 5-1 or 8-1 or 10-1. And if a tent manufacturer is telling us that we need to get out of the tent at 38 miles an hour when they know that they've engineered at 110 miles an hour, well, that's just about a 3-1 factor of safety. And I'm using wind speeds and a factor of safety maybe a little bit incorrectly for those who are the cognoscenti on this, but it's just for the sake of discussion. It's more to the point of, what Doug engages in these operation management plan developments, these safety plan developments, and the hazard mitigation plans, and that's when these trigger points become all that much more important. Because if we just talk about something ostensibly as simple as a wind triggering threshold when some action has to happen, that automatically leads us into things like crowd management and how many people are there and how do we get them where we need them to go in whatever time frame is beneficial for everybody. So now what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, that's what, between you guys, talking about this, usually it's a music festival that has some of these parameters that we have to talk about what our plans are and, what we're providing, what type of structure and all that good stuff. Usually, there are standard sites that require that. But at these festivals that we've worked at, we are usually the ones that hear about the weather event when it's occurring, when we're working there on site. They themselves, the festival owners and the operations groups, come up with plans themselves, and they let us know, hey, the wind's going to be picking up here, or with some lightning coming in, you guys, let's seek shelter. You guys may want to either stop for the day or come inside, let's wait it out. So communication is one of those things. That's why a lot of these places use radios, because they're really easy and quick to talk to somebody with. But those are just so big events that, like Doug was saying, there's so many variables in it. There's every site is completely different. There's certain different exit points. There's different entry points at every single one. Some are bigger, some are smaller, and it's just how it worked out. And I think that's what some of the listeners are wanting to know and understand and get some clarity on. That is, when we're talking about maybe like just a standard event, a groundbreaking, or something at somebody's corporate office for a Christmas party, when does the conversation about like the evacuation or severe weather planning, when should that come into play? Is that something that the sales team should be discussing with them, or is that something that you see an AHJ brings to the table, asking the customer themselves, the client, and then we relay the message of what our tents are rated at and all that? Richard, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, I think the key, a key motivating factor there is whether or not that, from the code official's perspective, is whether or not that event is required to have a permit. In some jurisdictions, if you erect a tent, you are required to have a permit. In other jurisdictions, that's not true. When you are required to have a permit, you are generally required to have what's known as construction documents. It's the layout of the tent. It's got to have the lateral supports, the lateral load resisting system, the wind load resisting system detailed. It's got to show the number of stakes or the amount of ballast. That's all part of the normal, usual, customary construction documents that will be required for a permit filing. That conversation usually includes how large is the area, how many structures, what's the spacing between the structures, how much space is there to accommodate the number of people there. Actually, I should back up and say the amount of space that that is enclosed by the event perimeter is going to dictate the allowable capacity occupancy for that particular event. And there are a number of variables that factor into limiting or allowing more people within a given space. Now that said,
Richard, I would also say exits actually, right? Because it is occupancy space, but if there's a limitation of exit, then that's going to be a guiding factor as well.
you're right, because you don't want people bottleneck. Judd, how many events that you work on have a let's call it first specifically a weather hazard plan?
It's hard to say. They all have some variation, right? There's either it comes in a packet from an engineer as an operations plan, or there is one that is a lot more comprehensive, put together by the organizer. It just depends.
That's sort of the answer I was looking for. The majority of them, or probably all of them, have some aspect of a weather hazard plan, right? I mean, would you agree?
Yeah.
90%. How many of the events you work on have discussions about that plan? 100%,
Well,
right?
everybody will talk about it, but for me, did we predefine the triggers and the decision makers? Do we know what those thresholds are? Are we talking about it in the planning process, or are we finding out now from the tent manufacturer or the tent provider after we've built it on site, and then someone's going, "Oh wait, we can only go up to that point." Those are the conversations that need to happen in the planning phase.
Exactly. Yeah, they do.
Yeah, for sure. And as we grow this tent rental industry, the engineering on these structures itself, we're getting asked more and more for certain parameters, certain numbers to be hit, certain, mile per hour ratings, right? And there are still they're more on the smaller size, probably like 40-foot and 50-foot widths and below, that people are still using that don't have any sort of engineering with it itself. It's very low, it is very minimal. And they're out there trying to, make a buck and rent what they have and get it out there. And it's until they get hit with from like an AHJ or somebody who starts really asking these questions for the engineering and they can't get it, that they're going to be, denied a permit, or they're going to be asked to provide a different style or a different kind of tent.
And forgive me for sounding like a cynic, but just because you have a permit from an AHJ doesn't mean it's safe, right? Like
Yes.
hopefully that's a threshold that they've done some review. But we've also, we've seen I've seen documents be presented that went for a permit, but they didn't consider the type of terrain or the type of ballast or the decking the tent is built on as a configuration component, when actually those things need to be taken together. Or the other, thing that we do as humans, which is we say, well, we did it last time, last weekend I was on soil and clay, and so we use stakes. Why can't we do it this time? Well, this time you're on asphalt and you're next to the ocean or something, so there are different variables that have to be considered.
And to be fair, you might be dealing with a permit official that is inexperienced or doesn't have the knowledge to understand what's going on with these temporary structures. That happens quite often as well.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what through ATA we've been doing some instruction and some courses and teaching some of these AHJs and code officials about our industry. I think there is a huge gray area between what they are getting from the code and what they need to interpret it and look at, compared to like what we are providing and what we know is a safe installation. And that's what ATA is really working on, trying to cut through that gray area and bring it closer together so we understand and they understand what a true safe installed tent looks like, what it needs, what the parameters are. Doug, like you're saying, just because you staked and did some stuff in some hard clay the 2 days before, now you're in some soft silt, it has completely different holding power in the stake itself. Might be time to just use ballast and call it a day and know that number is going to be that number and it's not going to change. And
Oh,
that's what I think a lot of these tent rental companies are starting to understand a lot more now, is you got to provide some of those numbers to help with understanding, is this truly a safe install, or did I cut a corner and just put a certain amount of weight at a leg, or did I just the stakes went in super easy, so we're just going to leave it at that.
We,
And
we've also seen limitations on the other end of it where, like I was working on an event once where a tent was built on a terrace where there was ballast brought in, and the ballast was twice what was called for in the engineering, which sounds great if you're in a windy place like near the ocean, for example. But actually, when you double the ballast that the engineering calls for on a structure, that can have implications on the safety of the building. So actually, that needs to be addressed very careful by the provider. And those kinds of things are examples of understanding what your constraints are.
Yeah,
that's exactly it. Yeah.
that example is an
And
interesting question, and these are the things that we're giving some very good examples about. The tip of this safety awareness conversation is really in the engineering controls. That's the tip of the iceberg. We can have it engineered. We can have permit review by people who are in theory knowledgeable and know what they're looking for and know what the expectations should be. But we really need to have the other part of the conversation about administrative controls. And that's when we take all of these engineering controls. It's good for 110 miles an hour. You got to have so many thousand pounds of ballast, or you got to have so many thousand pounds per stake of staking power, holding power. And we talk about now, what if? What if we have rain? Okay, we've put these stakes in on a dry day, and the compaction is very high, and the guy had to use a jackhammer to get the stakes in the ground. And we know based on our staking study, let's use that as a convenient grab here to know that we've got 1,000 pounds of holding power per stake. Okay, so what if it rains tomorrow? We just lost some of our holding capacity. And have we in fact accommodated for that in our installation? If we planned properly, we would look at what's the weather going to do. Are we using stakes? Are we using ballast? If we use either one of those things and the ground's wet, it is literally a game changer in terms of how the stake or the ballast reacts and how the structure will react. Now we got to go back to the manufacturer and look at their documentation and look at the design conditions. I'm willing to bet that most of them are giving you the most ideal set of installation conditions, because generally you're putting a tent up on a sunny day for a party. Now that example doesn't apply to a festival, but anyway, the administrative controls are the other part of the conversation I think that we get to.
I would agree. And I think that, kind of talking about what you're talking about, Richard, I did get asked that question. I did a presentation about 2 weeks ago for a local group of AHJs, code officials. And that was one of the questions. They said, hey, I know you got this holding power. It's a nice, hot, sunny day. What if this tent's up and, the ground conditions change, whether it's raining or, they wanted to water their grass so much that it, they wanted to look pretty for the event, what changes in that? And, I think it would be really interesting to really maybe one day look at some hard math on that and understand did you go above and beyond and give yourself a little extra room so that if it did lose some poundage, you're still in the realm of what you need? Or is it something that you're just going to have to send a bunch of stakes into the ground to help compensate for what you've lost? That's definitely an interesting one to think about. And go ahead.
If our goal today, and I think it is to give the listener at least food for thought, if not resources and tools to help them do better moving forward. When you're asked questions like that really by anyone, but especially by a code official, you don't ever want to have to say, I don't know. You want to be able to answer the question. You want to be able to defend your position. You want to be able to answer a question, with a period at the end of the sentence. Or you need to be prepared for an alternative plan. And what if the ground conditions change? Well, we've already factored that in, and we've put in more stakes than what we really need to put in. That's a full stop at the end of the sentence, and the permit official's probably going to say, great, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. But as soon as you say, well, I don't know, well, you've just decreased the confidence factor for that conversation.
So there's an aspect here of peer review, right? Like having somebody who understands the engineering and saying that it's
Hmm.
been built correctly. And that's different than having an AHJ do their
Hmm.
walkthrough or their review. And the other thing is just on a social level, understanding what the AHJ is looking for, because if they're trained as a fire marshal and they're coming through to do a walkthrough, or they're a building code official, they're looking at different things. They might be looking for source of ignition versus whether or not the water table is 3 feet down, or whether you're in dry conditions and it's going to affect, the water ballast, which I really don't even want to talk about because water ballast is not something I like to see, but it is an option in situations of limitation.
Hmm.
Yeah, and Bruce, I'm glad you said what you just said about the AHJ's perspective, because many of the AHJs, if they have a permit requirement for a tent, it's generally managed through the fire code officials, and it's probably going to be a fire code official that comes out to do the inspection. And it's a huge difference between what you see in the International Fire Code Chapter 31 requirements for tents versus what you would see in the International Building Code for temporary structures. And in fact, that this has been a topic of conversation amongst code officials. It's a very hot topic of conversation amongst code officials in that in jurisdictions where the fire code official is responsible for the permit, and then they're being asked to review structural, they don't know what to do, and they say, we don't know how to handle this. We need to pass this over to the structural people, to the building people. And a lot of times those people aren't available because they're not in the normal permitting process. And this becomes a very important factor. I mean, I've seen building code officials or fire code officials stand up in code meetings and say, you're requiring me as a fire code official to review structural, and I'm prohibited by law in my state to do that. So I have a conflict. And what do we do about that, rhetorically speaking?
It comes to my brain while we've got of the listening audience and we're talking about review of safety components, especially, things that often are permitted. Electrical power comes to my mind. And
Hmm.
not to get too deep down the rabbit hole, but applying power and having it inside tents makes a lot of sense to me. We sometimes we hang motors, we hang lighting, and it's all great. But the smaller tents that come with a lighting instrument, it's not uncommon for me to see either the grounding pin broken out or has fallen out, or an extension cord that's it's got bites out of it because it's been through the ringer or it's been used for years and it's falling apart. I ask the tenting community to please look at your gear, put stuff out there that is electrically safe, and do right by your customers, because it's not uncommon to see things that I'm sorry the lamps get beat up and the cables get beat up, but I think it is an important part of the safety package.
Yeah. I'll just touch on that, Doug, since, I'm an operator, running a business with those parameters in mind, that your safety package is a necessity on that tent. It is going to be required certain square footage or in certain aspects of what you're installing. Sometimes a small food tent could require a safety package depending on how the code official wants to read it and justify it. Keep those things in good working condition, because that's what makes or breaks if people know where to go, right? And when in an emergency, the cables, like you're saying, the extension cords, yeah, we throw and we beat them up a little bit. And when you're getting those back, have somebody in your warehouse or whatever go through them and double check that those prongs are good and straight and they're not missing. There's no chomps out of it, like you're saying. Your fire extinguishers, you need to get them serviced once a year and check them throughout the as you're installing them, putting them up, or as you're getting them prepped to go out, and make sure they haven't been, set off or they're in their safe zone of a working area. And, work and make sure you have those items and they're in clean, good working shape and they're all uniform. That's what, once you start having uniformity to some of those things, that these code officials will notice that in your company and go, they're taking it serious. They know what's going on. And that's going to help ease those conversations about when you're walking through and they're seeing that every exit sign you own is exactly the same. Every fire extinguisher you own is the same at the same height. Every no smoking sign, whatever's needed is all very much the same. You're not running into, printed laminated things that are just slapped on a tent. You're taking the time out to create a very nice product. And that's going to help you get further with those code officials and those inspectors looking at your stuff because they're going to say, you're taking this serious. And they're going to not be nitpicking as much at certain things. They're going to understand that you're here and you want to provide a good, clean safety package for those people in those tents.
I think it's beyond inspection. I think it's just good for business. I mean, it's good for the employees
Hmm.
that are out building them to have well-organized trucks and well-organized spaces, to have good equipment to work with. It reflects on the company overall. I'm sure we've all seen a wide range of equipment in different conditions, or some of it's been through its lifespan already, but it's still out on the road. Those are just things to think about because they're minor details, but they add up to part of the whole picture of the operation.
Agree wholeheartedly. It's not, well, first and foremost, if you're taking the time to take that kind of care with your own gear, you're minimizing the risk and you're minimizing the liability exposure that you have. You're not just increasing the perception. And absolutely, people notice when you're taking care of your gear. Don't ever think that they don't. Um, and if you're taking care of your gear and you're minimizing liability, that means things run more efficiently. That means you don't have any accidents or incidents, and that means you're more profitable. And let's face it, we want to be safe at our events, but they've got to be successful, right? They've got to make some money for us.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that will segue to what we're going to kind of wrap up with and talk about is that when I talked to you both individually, I had discussed that the last couple of years, the tent rental division of ATA and working with some of the other associations are working on the safe tenting professional program, right? Where we can professionalize our industry, certify people to say that yes, they know what anchoring a tent looks like, what staking it in the ground, and all those parameters we were talking about earlier look like, what style of tent and how to truly install it, and what it takes, from a smaller 10-foot wide tent up to a structure tent and what that is. So that is what TRD's mission going forward is to not only work and help educate with AHJs, code officials, but also to help educate our tenting installers and our people working in their office, our leads out there, to bring up that professionality to them to build a safer industry that we can all agree, this tent's been done right, it's been safely installed, this crew knows what they're doing, and like you're saying, Doug, the truck is all clean, the pipes have been organized right, things aren't just thrown in, stuff isn't stacked on top of the exit signs, they're nicely put away and all that. So those are really interesting, and there's a computer-based training, it's called the Foundations of Safe Tenting, and that's one of the first courses we came out with, and it's about 2 hours to 2.5 hours long. It's a computer-based course, and it really kind of gives you the basics, right, of what truck loading should look like, what safety packages should look like. It even talks about the inspection process and all that. And from that, we've built the anchoring course, a frame tent course, and a pole tent course so that we can go out and teach and get everybody on the same page of what these installations should look like, whether it's the PPE that they're wearing and helping protect them from an incident or understanding what loads those tents can truly take. So that's pretty cool. And it's something that we've all been working really, really hard to do to help professionalize the industry.
I can add to that. That's an excellent thing, and I think that once that training and certification program gets to the point where it's nationally recognized, uniformly recognized, I think that's, to me, it seems like that's almost the holy grail that the tent industry is looking for, is to make sure that everybody's playing on the same field, the same game, and therefore everyone has the same expectations about what's going to happen on a site with that structure during installation and use and whatever. I can also add that in the past year, on the standards development side, I've seen more interest from the tent industry than ever before. The Event Safety Working Group within our technical standards program has a document called ES 1.19, which is structural safety requirements for special event structures. And essentially, it's sort of a catch-all standard for all types of temporary structures, and it points people to the right places in codes and other standards. It's sort of an amalgamation of everything that's available in a one-stop shop. When we opened that up for revision this past year, the single most important thing that we saw as needing revisions was the tent section. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that document has never really had a robust tent section because, well, guess what? Tents have their own little section, now huge section in the fire code. And that's where everybody goes when they need to know what their requirements are. So we sort of left it alone there and just pointed people to Chapter 31 of the Fire Code or ASCE 55 or whatever it was. We now have probably 20 tent industry participants who have joined that working group to help write the standards for tent industry. And I'm just amazed by that. I think it's a wonderful thing that industry has taken this interest.
Yeah, that's really good to hear about that. Doug, what are your kind of thoughts when we're talking about these safe tenting courses and what we're trying to teach the industry and professionalize it? Is that something that you look at as a safety professional of, okay, they're trained, they understand, there's some background there, and we can, work with these installers and they know what they're doing. Is that kind of what you're thinking about when you're hearing about these safe tenting professional programs?
Man, I'm excited to hear that you guys have training like that and sign me up because I love that kind of stuff. I think meeting people where they're at, I think delivering it in multilingual or asynchronous formats is really great to hear. I think you're leading the pack in terms of having material available to educate the next generation of tenting crew. And I'm really excited about the fact that there is actually a program out there that supports the initiative of safety.
For sure. And you kind of hit on variables earlier of different kind of variables in our industry that we have to take into account. And that was the same when we were designing this and coming up with these courses is everybody does things just a little bit different. Everybody loads their trucks just a little bit different, sets their tents just a little different. And we had to work together to kind of standardize, okay, this is putting all these pieces together. This is what we came out with that standardizes it and says, these are best practices, right? You're always going to have your internal ways of doing things, but these are the best practices that we have put together as industry professionals and are relaying it to the groups out there that, again, this is how we all feel is the best way to install, dismantle, and set up. Yeah, I think, this has been a great discussion. We do have our tent conference in Nashville, January 11th through the 13th in 2027. So it'll be here before you know it. And during that conference, we're going to have a session where we do talk more about this of safe evacuations and what that looks like. So as people are looking at the tent conference and going to it, check that out. We're going to have some rental places talk about that kind of discussion. But Doug and Richard, just to end it out, any kind of final last words?
Keep up the good work. The training and certification program is a huge step. It's a major step. It's an important step. Being involved in writing your own standards it's huge important. It's a huge step. And these, I think, are the kinds of things that industry needs to keep doing in order to make things better for our work and for the public and for events in general.
I just want to say it was a privilege to be here and to get to talk with you all. And, it's not surprising to me that we could go for hours talking about the safety of our industry and the components we think about. I'm glad to be here and I'm happy to be a resource to you or your audience.
Yeah, no, well, we appreciate both you guys coming in, discussing this and talking about it. Again, you guys have been in the trenches. You guys know what to look out for, and you guys are, again, helping us understand and bring some clarity to all these questions that get asked and all these unknowns that we are trying to sift through. So I appreciate it. Both you, Doug and Richard, you guys have been great. Thank you guys so much. We look forward to maybe talking to you in the future and hearing some other key aspects to help our industry grow and be a safer place. But again, thank you guys again for being on here.
My honor and pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of ATA Talking Textiles. ATA is a not-for-profit association representing the international specialty fabrics marketplace. Learn more about the events, workshops, and webinars ATA hosts throughout the year at textiles.org/events.